Before dawn, the sea gave up its secret. On April 30th, 1943, a Spanish fisherman walking the quiet shoreline near Huelva noticed something tangled in the tide. At first, he thought it was wreckage. The Mediterranean had been restless for days, storms rolling in from the Atlantic, waves slamming against the rocks. Debris was common. But this was not driftwood. It was a man. He wore a British uniform, Royal Marines. His life jacket was still strapped tight across his chest, the canvas darkened by salt and time. His face was pale, swollen by water. One gloved hand was clenched, as if even death had not persuaded him to let go. Strapped to his waist by a chain was a leather briefcase. That detail would matter. Spain was officially neutral in the war. Unofficially, it leaned toward Berlin. German agents moved through its ports and cafes like shadows that never quite disappeared. A dead British officer washing up on its southern coast was not an accident. It was an opportunity. The local authorities examined the body. Papers identified him as Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. His pockets told a quiet story of ordinary life interrupted. A used bus ticket, a receipt for a recent purchase, a photograph of a young woman smiling softly at the camera. On the back, in careful handwriting, a message signed simply, Pam. There were letters too, personal, intimate, the kind not meant for official eyes. They spoke of love, impatience, wedding plans delayed by war, of longing. And inside the briefcase were documents stamped top secret. They appeared to outline Allied invasion plans in the Mediterranean. Specific targets, specific dates, specific troop movements. If genuine, they would reveal where the next great blow of the war would fall. The Spanish officials, cautious but curious, did what they had done before with sensitive discoveries. They allowed certain people to see them. In Madrid, German intelligence officers read the contents with growing interest. The Abwehr, the military intelligence service of the Third Reich, had been waiting for clues. The Allies were preparing something. Everyone knew it. The only question was where. Greece? Sardinia? Sicily? The documents seemed to answer that question. In Berlin, the information climbed the chain of command. Analysts compared it with other intercepted signals. It fit. It made sense. It aligned with what they believed the Allies were capable of, and what they feared. Soon, the papers would land on the desk of Adolf Hitler himself. And Hitler would make decisions. Divisions would move, defenses would shift, mines would be laid in the wrong harbors, artillery would be positioned to face the wrong horizon, all because of a dead man on a Spanish beach. The British, meanwhile, waited. In London, behind closed doors thick enough to muffle the sound of bombing raids, a small group of officers watched for signs. They did not celebrate, not yet. Deception was a delicate art, if the Germans suspected even a trace of manipulation, the entire illusion would collapse. They needed confirmation, proof that the lie had been swallowed whole. Days later, the briefcase was returned to British hands through official diplomatic channels. It appeared untouched, but appearances deceive. Under a microscope, experts examined the envelope seals, the fibers of the paper, the minute disturbances in dried glue. The conclusion was clear. The letters had been opened and read. In that moment, somewhere between a laboratory in London and a quiet grave in Spain, a man who had never truly existed began to alter the course of a global war. His name was Major William Martin. He had a rank. He had a fiancée. He had secrets. What he did not have, at least not anymore, was a heartbeat. And that was precisely the point. By the spring of 1943, the war had changed its rhythm. The early years had belonged to lightning strikes and collapsing front lines. Poland had fallen in weeks, France in days. The German army had once seemed unstoppable, a machine of steel and certainty, advancing across Europe with terrifying precision. But now, something was different. In February, on the frozen banks of the Volga, the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad. It was not just a military defeat. It was psychological. For the first time, the myth of invincibility had cracked. The Reich was still powerful, but it was bleeding. In North Africa, another front was shifting. Allied forces under British and American command had pushed German and Italian troops westward. The Desert War, long, brutal, and unforgiving, was nearing its end. The Mediterranean, once dominated by Axis supply lines, was becoming an Allied corridor. The question now was not if the Allies would strike Europe, but where. London, Washington, and their generals faced a dilemma. They needed to open a new front to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin had been demanding it relentlessly. The Red Army was carrying the heaviest burden of the war. A second front in Europe would force Germany to divide its strength. But a direct invasion of France in 1943 was not yet possible. The forces were not ready. The ships were not sufficient. The air superiority incomplete. So attention turned south. The Mediterranean was the obvious stepping stone. From there, the Allies could invade what Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. The most logical target was Sicily. Geographically, it made perfect sense. The island sat like a locked gate between North Africa and mainland Italy. Capture Sicily, and the Allies would control Mediterranean shipping lanes. Capture Sicily, and Italy, already exhausted, might collapse. Capture Sicily, and Germany would be forced to defend yet another front. There was only one problem. It was too obvious. German commanders knew Sicily mattered. They had fortified it heavily. Coastal defenses, artillery batteries, airfields, anti-aircraft guns. Intelligence reports suggested that Berlin expected an Allied move there sooner or later. The element of surprise, the single most valuable currency in war, was slipping away. In Berlin, analysts pored over intercepted radio transmissions. In Athens and Rome, Axis commanders strengthened defensive positions. German divisions stood ready to reinforce the island at the first sign of invasion. To strike Sicily head-on without deception would be costly, perhaps catastrophically so. The Allies needed Germany to look somewhere else. Not casually, not vaguely. They needed Germany to commit resources elsewhere, to move divisions, to reposition artillery, to weaken Sicily, not by bombardment, but by doubt. The strategy of deception was not new. Throughout history, armies had relied on misdirection, false retreats, dummy camps, fake radio traffic. But this war was different. Intelligence had become a science. Signals were decoded, photographs analyzed, every detail scrutinized. The Germans were cautious, sometimes paranoid. To deceive them now would require something extraordinary, something intimate, something human. In London, a small and little-known department quietly specialized in such work. It did not command tanks or bombers. It did not appear in newspaper headlines. Its victories, when they came, were invisible. The British called it the 20 Committee, a name that hinted at its purpose. The Roman numeral for 20 is 20. Double cross. Its mission was simple in theory. Turn enemy agents into channels of misinformation. Feed Berlin carefully constructed lies. Make the enemy believe he had uncovered the truth himself. But even the most skillful web of misinformation needed a centerpiece. A story so convincing that it would anchor all the smaller lies around it. And time was running short. The invasion of Sicily, codenamed Operation Husky, was already being prepared. Ships were gathering, troops were training, logistics were moving into place across North Africa. The Germans would notice. They always noticed. The Allies needed a narrative that would redirect German attention before the real assault began. Not a rumor, not a whisper, a revelation. In a quiet office in London, two intelligence officers began discussing an idea so improbable it bordered on absurd. If you wanted the enemy to believe something completely, not just suspect it, you had to give him evidence he could hold in his hands. Not forged signals, not staged radio chatter, but documents, personal documents, carried by a man who had died in service of his country, a man whose tragedy would appear accidental, a man whose loss would seem authentic. The war in 1943 demanded boldness. It demanded imagination. It demanded a lie so intricate that it would feel more real than truth. Somewhere in London, the seed of that lie was taking shape. It began not with a battlefield map, but with a question. What if the invasion plans fell into German hands, on purpose? And what if they were attached to a body? The idea lingered in the air, at first unspoken. War had already asked men to do terrible things. This would be something new. Not an act of violence, but an act of theater, staged on the edge of the sea. And before it could succeed, someone would have to become a soldier who had never lived. In a war dominated by generals and dictators, some of the most decisive battles were planned by men who rarely raised their voices. They worked in offices that smelled of paper, tobacco, and damp wool. Outside, London was still under threat of air raids. Windows were taped, lights dimmed, typewriters clattered in the half-dark like nervous insects. Inside Naval Intelligence Division Room 13, an idea was about to leave the realm of speculation. One of the men behind the desk was Ewan Montague, a barrister by training, precise in speech, and almost disarmingly calm. He had the kind of face that could blend into any committee meeting. No dramatic gestures, no raised tones. But he possessed something far more dangerous: patience. Across from him, often slightly hunched, was Charles Cholmondeley of M15, tall, thin, awkward in manner. The sort of man people underestimated instantly, which in intelligence work was a gift. Cholmondeley had once stumbled across a curious memo written years earlier by British naval intelligence. The document, unofficially known as the Trout Memo, suggested that deception in wartime should resemble fly fishing. The enemy, like a trout, must be lured, tempted, made to bite voluntarily. One of its more unusual suggestions proposed planting false documents on a body and allowing it to wash ashore where the enemy might find it. At the time it had seemed theoretical, morbid, almost literary. Now it felt necessary. The Mediterranean situation demanded bold deception. Sicily had to appear secondary, even irrelevant, while Greece and Sardinia looked like the true targets. Montague studied the proposal carefully. The challenge was not merely to create false documents. That was simple enough. The challenge was credibility. If the Germans suspected manipulation, the entire operation would collapse. Worse, it would confirm that Sicily was indeed the real objective. The lie had to survive scrutiny. They began outlining requirements. First, the body. It had to be real. Artificial staging would never withstand forensic inspection. The man would need to appear as a genuine victim of an air crash or maritime accident. Second, the identity. The officer could not be too important. High-ranking enough to carry sensitive documents, but not so senior that his disappearance would provoke impossible verification. Third, the location. Spain offered the perfect stage. Officially neutral, yet sympathetic to Germany. Spanish officials would inevitably allow German intelligence access to anything intriguing that washed ashore. Fourth, and most critical, the details. War had taught them that intelligence officers did not trust grand gestures. They trusted the mundane, human flaws, personal clutter, the randomness of real life. A forged invasion plan alone would not suffice. The officer would need a fiancé, a recent argument, an unpaid bill, a photograph creased from being carried in a pocket, letters that felt unfinished, imperfect, intimate. The illusion had to be layered so thoroughly that even a suspicious German analyst would hesitate. Montague later reflected that deception was not about inventing something new. It was about building a story the enemy already half believed. Berlin was convinced that the Allies might strike the Balkans. Greece was politically unstable. Sardinia was exposed. The narrative only needed reinforcement. If documents accidentally confirmed these suspicions, German command would likely treat them as validation rather than provocation. But before paperwork and theater came a more uncomfortable question. Where would they find the man? The war had produced no shortage of death, bombings, shipwrecks, hospitals filled with casualties. Yet, using a body for strategic deception crossed an invisible line. It required discretion, secrecy even from those who might morally object. Montague approached a trusted pathologist in London. The request was delivered calmly, almost clinically. They needed a body, not a soldier killed in action. That would complicate records, not someone with family actively searching. The death had to be recent enough to withstand examination, yet without immediate public attention. It was an unspoken understanding. The war justified methods that peacetime would condemn. Eventually they found him. A Welshman who had died quietly, unnoticed by the world. No battlefield heroics, no grand sacrifice, just a life that had ended in obscurity. In death, he would become something else. Before his transformation could begin, Montague and Cholmondeley constructed the ghost he would inhabit. Name: Major William Martin. Unit: Royal Marines. Rank: plausible. Age: believable. They requested authentic uniform pieces, identity papers, a service number that fit official records without triggering contradictions. Then came the personal touches. They hired a secretary to pose as Pam. A photograph was taken, warm smile, soft lighting. On the back, handwritten affection. Not too polished, not overly sentimental. Love letters were composed carefully. They avoided dramatic prose. Instead, they included small irritations, mild jealousy, complaints about delayed wedding plans. Human beings rarely write perfectly under emotional strain. So the letters were imperfect. Receipts were inserted into his pockets. A bank overdraft notice, a theater ticket stub, the kind of trivial evidence that suggested he had existed beyond military duty. The briefcase, chained to his wrist, contained the crown jewel. Letters between senior Allied commanders hinting that Greece and Sardinia were the true invasion targets. Sicily was mentioned almost dismissively as a diversion. The tone was critical. Too formal, and it would feel staged. Too casual, and it would seem reckless. Every word was measured. As preparations advanced, Montague understood something essential. Once released, the operation would be uncontrollable. They could not guide German interpretation. They could only hope to influence it. It was like releasing a message in a bottle, trusting currents, wind, and chance. On paper, the plan was elegant. In reality, it balanced on unpredictable variables. Would the body decompose too quickly? Would Spanish authorities conduct an overly thorough autopsy? Would German intelligence suspect British manipulation? Would Berlin dismiss the documents as too convenient? The smallest miscalculation could undo everything. And yet, in the silent tension of 1943, doing nothing felt riskier. Montague closed the folder one evening and looked at Cholmondeley. "If we're going to lie," he reportedly said in effect, "we must lie beautifully." The ghost was ready. All that remained was to send him to sea. The transformation began in silence. In a refrigerated room in London, beneath fluorescent lights that hummed faintly against the wartime blackout, a man who had died unnoticed was prepared for his final assignment. His real name was Glyndwr Michael. Few had known him well in life. Fewer would remember him after death. He had been Welsh, unemployed, alone. His passing, the result of ingesting poison, was tragic, but unremarkable in a country exhausted by war. In another time, another year, he might have been buried quietly, his name dissolving into parish records. Instead, history would borrow him. The pathologist handling the matter understood the stakes. Official records would be minimal. The body needed to show no signs inconsistent with drowning. Timing would matter. Decomposition had to suggest several days at sea, not weeks. Too fresh would arouse suspicion. Too deteriorated would prevent proper identification. The British were not staging a spectacle. They were constructing plausibility. Once clothed in a Royal Marines uniform, the transformation deepened. Rank insignia were attached carefully. A life jacket was secured across his chest. In his pockets, the life of Major William Martin began to accumulate. The wallet came first. Inside, identity card, service number, letters folded along realistic creases. A photograph of Pam, her expression open and hopeful. On the back, a line in affectionate handwriting. "Till we're together again, all my love, Pam." The paper had been worn slightly at the edges, as if carried daily. The ink was chosen to bleed subtly under moisture, but not disintegrate entirely. Next, the financial traces. A letter from Lloyd's Bank referencing an overdraft. Receipts from a London club. A theater ticket stub. Minor frustrations of civilian life woven into military duty. It was not enough for Major Martin to exist as an officer. He had to exist as a man. Montague understood this instinctively. Intelligence officers in Berlin were trained to distrust grand strategy documents. But they were also human. A photograph, a romantic letter, an overdue bill. These details whispered authenticity. War plans could be forged. Ordinary life was harder to fake convincingly. The briefcase was attached last, chained to the wrist, not too tightly. The metal needed to appear functional, not theatrical. Inside lay the documents that would tilt armies. They were letters between high-ranking Allied officers, referencing impending operations in the Mediterranean. Greece was discussed as a primary objective. Sardinia received significant attention. Sicily was framed almost casually, a possible diversion to distract Axis forces. The wording was deliberate. No dramatic declarations. No explicit instructions. Instead, subtle references that implied larger truths. The Germans were expected to read between the lines, and they would. Because they wanted to. That was the essential gamble. Berlin had already considered the Balkans vulnerable. Intelligence suggested the Allies might strike through Greece to destabilize southern Europe. The planted documents would confirm this bias. A good deception does not invent belief. It reinforces it. As preparations concluded, one more variable loomed: delivery. The body could not simply be dropped into water at random. Ocean currents had to carry it naturally toward the Spanish coast, near Huelva, an area known for discreet German intelligence activity. Spanish officials there were cooperative enough to allow access, but cautious enough to maintain plausible neutrality. The Royal Navy submarine, HMS Seraph, was selected for the task. The officers aboard were told little. Secrecy extended even within the British command structure. On the night before departure, the submarine's crew was informed they would be transporting a meteorological instrument, a fiction necessary to avoid awkward questions. When the container was opened at sea, only a small circle of officers knew the truth. Inside lay Major William Martin. The Mediterranean night was cold when they surfaced off the Spanish coast in the early hours of April 30th, 1943. The sea moved with steady indifference, waves catching faint moonlight. There was no ceremony, no salute. A quiet moment, perhaps. Then the body was committed to the water. The current accepted him without resistance. For a brief second, he floated, uniform dark against the pale reflection of the moon. Then he drifted, carried by tides calculated weeks earlier in London offices. War often demanded noise, artillery, explosions, shouting commands. This demanded silence. Below deck, the submarine withdrew. Above, the sea resumed its ancient rhythm. Now the operation was beyond British control. They could not adjust it, could not intervene, could not ensure the body would be found quickly, or at all. The plan depended on chance. Would a fisherman notice him before decomposition advanced too far? Would Spanish authorities treat him as a routine casualty, or something suspicious? Would German intelligence be alerted promptly? Every stage required the cooperation of people who did not know they were cooperating. In London, Montague waited. Intelligence work rarely provided immediate feedback. Days could pass without confirmation. The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, was already locked into motion. Thousands of soldiers were preparing, ships were being fueled, aircraft positioned. If the deception failed, those men would face reinforced defenses. If it succeeded, German divisions might stand guarding empty coastlines. On the morning of April 30th, near Huelva, a fisherman walked along the shore. He saw something in the tide and bent down to look closer. The ghost had arrived. The fisherman did not know he was touching history. He saw only a body drifting against the tide near Huelva, uniform darkened by salt, boots heavy with water. The Mediterranean had a way of delivering what it wished to reveal. That morning, it revealed a British officer. Spanish authorities were notified quickly. Spain was neutral officially, but neutrality in 1943 was a careful performance. Francisco Franco ruled with calculated caution, balancing between appeasing Berlin and avoiding full entry into the war. The body was examined. The uniform was real. The identification consistent. The briefcase intriguing. It was chained to the wrist, as if the officer had died protecting its contents. That detail mattered. A staged deception might have been too neat, but this appeared accidental, tragic even. An aircraft lost at sea perhaps. A courier drowned before reaching his destination. The Spanish pathologist conducted an autopsy. The conclusion: death by drowning. It was a reasonable assumption. The body bore no signs that would contradict it. The sea had done its work. But the briefcase, that was the true prize. Spanish officials understood its significance immediately. Rather than return it untouched to the British consulate, they allowed discreet access to German intelligence operatives stationed in the region. Germany's military intelligence service, the Abwehr, had long operated quietly in Spain. Its officers moved through ports and cafes with professional patience. When word reached them of the recovered British officer and the documents he carried, they acted swiftly. The briefcase was opened carefully, not torn, not broken, opened. Inside were letters stamped, top secret, correspondence between senior Allied commanders discussing upcoming operations in the Mediterranean. The Germans read with increasing focus. Greece was referenced repeatedly. Sardinia appeared as a key objective. Sicily was mentioned, but almost dismissively. It fit too well, and that was precisely why it worked. Berlin already suspected that the Allies might attempt a Balkan invasion. Greece was politically unstable. A strike there could cut German supply lines and threaten southern Europe. Sardinia's location made it strategically plausible. The documents did not introduce a wild new idea. They confirmed an existing fear. German intelligence officers analyzed the materials closely. The tone of the letters felt authentic, not theatrical, not exaggerated. The language was bureaucratic, even mildly irritated in places. There were hints of inter-Allied disagreements, subtle references to logistical difficulties. Imperfection breeds credibility. Had the documents been overly confident or dramatic, suspicion might have followed. Instead, they carried the quiet texture of real military correspondence. But Germany had learned caution. Years earlier, they had fallen victim to deception in smaller operations. The British were not amateurs, so the Abwehr proceeded methodically. The documents were photographed. Copies were sent up the chain of command. The originals were resealed as carefully as possible. This detail would later reassure London. Under microscopic examination, British experts would detect slight disturbances in the envelopes, confirmation that the contents had been read. In Berlin, analysts compared the material with other intelligence sources: signals intercepts, reconnaissance reports, agent communications. The puzzle pieces aligned. The Allies were massing forces in North Africa. They were clearly preparing something significant. The question had always been where. Now, the answer seemed to lie in Greece and Sardinia. When the information reached Adolf Hitler, it reinforced his own instincts. Hitler had long feared a Balkan invasion. The region had personal and ideological importance to him. He distrusted Italy's ability to defend itself. He suspected that the Allies might attempt to fracture Axis influence in southeastern Europe. The documents felt like confirmation. Orders followed. German divisions were redirected toward Greece. Defensive positions in the Balkans were strengthened. Sardinia's garrison was reinforced. Resources, troops, artillery, aircraft were shifted. Every division moved east or north was one less available for Sicily. In military terms, deception is not measured by whether the enemy believes a story. It is measured by whether the enemy acts on it. And Germany acted. Back in London, Montagu and his colleagues waited for signs. They did not have direct access to German internal communications. Instead, they relied on secondary indicators. Increased troop movement in Greece. Reinforcement reports intercepted through signals intelligence. Shifts in Axis deployments. Gradually, the pattern emerged. The Germans had adjusted their defenses, not toward Sicily, but away from it. The lie was working. But war rarely rewards overconfidence. There remained one final test. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces would launch Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. If the deception had succeeded, resistance would be thinner than expected. If it had failed, thousands would pay the price. For weeks, the ghost of Major William Martin lay buried in Spanish soil. His briefcase returned to British hands through formal diplomatic channels. Officially, he had died in service of his country. Unofficially, he was still fighting, because somewhere in the Mediterranean, German commanders were staring at maps and preparing for an invasion that would never come. Dawn broke over the Mediterranean on July 10, 1943, with the low thunder of engines. Hundreds of ships cut through the water toward Sicily. Landing craft bobbed in uneasy formation. Paratroopers prepared to jump into darkness, lit only by distant artillery flashes. The sea, calm in appearance, carried the weight of one of the largest amphibious operations ever attempted. Operation Husky had begun. For months, Allied planners had feared the same possibility, that Sicily would become a fortress. German divisions entrenched along the coast. Artillery sighted on every approach. Reinforcements poised to counterattack within hours. If the deception had failed, this morning would become a slaughter. Aboard the ships, soldiers did not know about Major William Martin. They did not know about Huelva, or the briefcase, or the letters that had crossed Hitler's desk. They knew only their orders. Land, secure the beaches, advance inland. War is rarely experienced as grand strategy. It is experienced as noise, fear, and motion. The first waves hit the southern shores of Sicily under heavy winds. Some landing craft were blown off course. Paratroopers were scattered miles from their intended drop zones. Chaos reigned in the air. And yet, the coastal defenses were not as overwhelming as feared. Resistance was present, certainly. Italian units fought in places with determination. German forces responded quickly once the scale of the invasion became clear. But something was missing. The concentration, the density of troops, the immediate overwhelming counterattack that planners had braced for. In the critical early hours, the Allies secured key beachheads more rapidly than intelligence had predicted. The Germans had divisions in Sicily, yes, but crucial reinforcements were positioned elsewhere, guarding Greece, strengthening the Balkans, preparing for an invasion that never materialized. The redistribution had consequences. German high command had shifted elite units eastward. Coastal artillery and air assets had been recalibrated according to perceived threats. Every strategic decision is a gamble of allocation. Where to place strength, where to risk weakness. Operation Mincemeat had tilted that balance. Within days, Allied forces pushed inland. The island's geography, rugged hills, narrow roads, slowed progress, but the momentum was undeniable. Axis command scrambled to respond. German commanders began transferring troops back toward Sicily, but war punishes delay. By the time full clarity emerged in Berlin, the Allies had established a firm foothold. The deception had bought time. Time in war is often measured in blood saved. In London, intelligence analysts observed developments cautiously. Signals intercepts, suggested German confusion. Reports indicated reinforcement requests for Sicily that could not be fulfilled immediately. The lie had not eliminated resistance. It had diluted it. As Allied troops advanced, another effect became visible: political shockwaves. The invasion of Sicily destabilized Italy. Mussolini's authority, already weakened by years of setbacks, faltered further. Within weeks of the landings, the fascist Grand Council turned against him. On July 25, 1943, Benito Mussolini was arrested by his own government. Italy would soon begin negotiating its exit from the war. The Mediterranean campaign had shifted from theory to irreversible reality. Historians would later debate how decisive Operation Mincemeat truly was. Sicily was likely to fall eventually. German commanders were capable and adaptive. War is never determined by a single thread. But deception had influenced decisions at the highest level. It had redirected attention, even temporarily. And in war, temporary misjudgment can produce lasting consequences. Hitler's instinct to defend the Balkans had been sharpened, not softened, by the documents recovered in Spain. The corpse had whispered in his ear. In military planning rooms across Europe, maps were redrawn based on information that had originated in a refrigerated room in London. Major William Martin had done his job. He had convinced the enemy. And now, as Sicily burned under bombardment and advancing infantry, the question shifted from whether the deception had worked to something more complicated. What does it mean to win a battle with a lie? Because the cost had not been paid in secrecy alone. It had required using a human body as a strategic instrument. The invasion succeeded. Sicily fell by mid-August. The Axis position in southern Europe fractured. But beneath the statistics and troop movements lay an uncomfortable truth. The war had asked Britain to create a ghost, and the ghost had delivered. Wars simplify morality. They compress it, flatten it, turn right and wrong into calculations of outcome. But some stories resist simplification. When Sicily fell and Mussolini was removed from power, the success of deception was celebrated quietly within British intelligence. Not publicly, never publicly. Intelligence victories are rarely announced in real time. They exist in classified files, in internal memoranda, in nods exchanged behind closed doors. Officially, Major William Martin had died at sea. He was buried with military honors in Huelva. A gravestone marked his name, rank, and date of death. To the world, he was a real officer lost in service. But beneath that stone lay Glyndwr Michael. For years, his true identity remained concealed. Even many within British government circles did not know the details. Secrecy had to endure beyond victory. The success of Operation Mincemeat depended partly on Germany never fully understanding how they had been misled. After the war, intelligence files were gradually declassified. In 1953, Ewan Montague published an account titled "The Man Who Never Was." It described the operation, though not every detail. Some truths were still withheld. Glyndwr Michael's name did not appear. The public embraced the story as brilliant espionage, a masterstroke of psychological warfare. But brilliance invites reflection. Who was Glyndwr Michael? He was not a soldier killed in combat. He had not volunteered for sacrifice. His life had been marked by hardship, homelessness, poverty, isolation. In death, he was transformed into an instrument of state strategy. Was that exploitation or redemption? Montague later suggested that Michael had been given dignity in death, a role in something larger than himself. He received a grave, recognition, and eventual acknowledgement. Decades later, historians and researchers uncovered his true name, and the gravestone in Huelva was amended to reflect both identities. Today, it reads, Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin, RM. The duality remains. From a strategic standpoint, the operation saved lives. By diverting German forces, it likely reduced casualties during the Sicilian invasion. Every division misallocated meant fewer soldiers facing concentrated fire. If a single body could spare thousands, was the moral equation justified? Wartime intelligence rarely offers clean answers. Operation Mincemeat did not rely on brutality or violence. It relied on narrative, on understanding how humans interpret evidence. The Germans were not fools. They examined the documents carefully. They questioned authenticity. They weighed plausibility. In the end, they believed. Not because they were careless, but because the story aligned with their expectations. That alignment is what makes the operation so unsettling. It was not deception by trickery alone. It was deception by psychology. And psychology is not confined to war. The operation revealed something deeper about power. That belief shapes action more forcefully than fact. That a forged document, if plausible enough, can move armies. For intelligence officers, the lesson was clear. For historians, the lesson is more complicated. The story is often told as clever and daring, and it was. But beneath the cleverness lies the quiet image of a man who never consented to the role history assigned him. And yet, without Glyndwr Michael, there would have been no Major William Martin. Without Major Martin, there might have been a bloodier Sicily. And without Sicily, the collapse of fascist Italy might have unfolded differently. History sometimes hinges not on kings or generals, but on anonymous lives repurposed by circumstance. In the end, Operation Mincemeat was not simply about fooling Hitler. It was about understanding him. It was about predicting fear. It was about crafting a narrative so carefully that even suspicion could not unravel it. Major William Martin never lived. Glyndwr Michael lived quietly and died quietly. But together, they altered the trajectory of a global war. And somewhere beneath Spanish soil, a gravestone bears two names, one real, one invented, bound together by the strange arithmetic of history.